Okay, it's 11:02. Good morning and afternoon, depending on your location in the world, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 10 Ways to Revamp Your TMF QC Process. My name is Isaiah Howard, and I'm the Director of Marketing for LMK Clinical Research Consulting. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. The webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all attendees within 24 to 48 hours via email. You should be listening in using your computer speaker systems by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, please select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question box. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A sessions. I would now like to introduce Shaleak Divan, President and CEO of LMK Clinical Research Consulting.
Great. Thank you so much, Isaiah, and welcome everyone. As Isaiah said, good morning, afternoon, depending on your location in the world. Thank you for spending some time with us today to discuss 10 ways to revamp your TMF QC process. I'm very excited to share my personal experience with you all, and if you have any questions, as Isaiah mentioned, please feel free to type them in the question pane, and I will be happy to answer them throughout the after the presentation. So let's get started. Just to let you know a little bit about LMK, we are a global TMF functional service provider of trial master file services and consulting. We are an eTMF agnostic company, which means we actually do not have a eTMF technology, but we do support the services and consulting piece that accompanies the technologies. We are headquartered in North Carolina. We are the only TMF services and consulting company that is certified women-owned, so by WeBank. All of our employees are TMF University certified. Our TMF University program is actually an award-winning training program. We have 18 TMF courses across 3 different learning levels: novice, intermediate, and advanced. And if you would like to learn more information about that, please feel free to visit our website. We have a new TMF service offering. It's called TMF Complete. It is a comprehensive TMF QC review process that is based on ICH GCP Release 2 requirements. And I'm sure that many of you are concerned, as you should be, because there's a lot happening with ICH and the update to GCP. We haven't seen an update to GCP in over 20 years. So this update is very exciting, maybe a little bit scary for most of you, but our TMF Complete service offering is based on this principle. It's also based on Six Sigma principles and the Metric Champion Consortium's definition and recommendations for TMF metrics. So TMF Complete is a service offering that's performed by TMF University certified employees at LMK. We have a passion and a high regard for the TMF. Everyone at LMK has a background in clinical operations and TMF. And we look at the TMF to determine completeness based on a variety of factors for all phases of clinical trials across all therapeutic areas. And this TMF Complete and LMK Complete service offering can be utilized to prepare for a regulatory inspection, or an oversight of partners and vendors, plans for a merger or acquisition, or to close out a study. It's really an innovative eTMF agnostic process that can be used across any organization regardless of their TMF format. electronic, paper, or hybrid. And if you'd like to learn more about our TMF Complete service offering, please visit our website, lmkclinicalresearch.com. So a little bit about me. I'm the president and CEO, I'm sorry about that, of LMK Clinical Research Consulting. I have over 15 years of experience in the industry. I started LMK based on really what I saw as a need to focus on people and process within the TMF. It is something that I think can be often overlooked because there's a lot of focus on technology. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I really felt like there needs to be a focus on the process of filing TMF documents, preparation for inspections and audits, and then also having really qualified people managing the TMF. Oftentimes and historically, the TMF is seen as an administrative task, and it really is not. It's really a very highly skilled, highly processed function, really. It's really quickly becoming its own function within study teams, and it really should be treated that way. So that's my philosophy, and that's really how I approach everything that I do, and that's really how we approach everything at LMK. I'm also the facilitator for the Metric Champions Consortium's TMF initiative. In this role, I lead a group of cross-functioning group to develop TMF metrics to determine TMF health. I'm also a subject matter expert for the TMF reference model. I use a lot of what I know to help other companies and help the industry as a whole develop processes for their TMF. So our agenda for today, so enough about me, our agenda for today is to go over 5 things. Why is TMF QC important? Why is TMF QC difficult? A lot of companies struggle with TMF QC. Then we'll get into 10 ways to revamp your TMF QC process. We'll talk about your frenemy, and I'll explain what a frenemy is just in case you don't know, and then a summary and a wrap-up of today's discussion. So let's start with why TMF QC is important. There are a number of reasons. I'm just going to kind of go over very high level why it's important. So you may have seen this graph before. This happens often. I'm sorry, I can't get the technical difficulties. Okay. This graph happens often. It is something that we see in our TMF world. I can't get it to stop. I apologize. It's something that we see in our TMF world on a daily basis, and it's really the filing of the TMF documents. And, you know, as you're going on in the clinical trial, you see that there is a lot of filing happening, and you see that oftentimes people wait until the end of the trial to file their TMF documents. And we have to stop doing that. You know, the TMF should really be contemporaneous with the clinical trial. So what we see here is what happens in many organizations where we're going along with the clinical trial. Maybe we'll see an uptick in documents, but we see the big uptick when there is an inspection or an audit, or it's the end of the study. So a lot of times we're leaving documents in our desk drawers or in our computers and then filing them and waiting until the very end. And this really has to stop. I mean, really what you want is a very linear distribution of TMF documents. You may see a couple of upticks here and there if there are events that occur, or at the beginning of the study, for instance, when all of the sites are being initiated, et cetera, you'll see an uptick, but it really shouldn't be this way. The regulatory agencies are telling us what they expect in terms of a complete TMF. A complete TMF is really the basis for inspection, and all documents in the TMF must be made available to the inspectors. Uh-oh. I think my slides weren't showing. I apologize for that. Okay, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Sorry about that. So the regulatory agencies are telling us that, sorry, I hope everyone can see my slides now. The regulatory agencies are telling us that they want a complete TMF, and it has to be made available to inspectors. The MHRA is telling us this. This is on their website. It's very clear, and it's very it's there for everyone to see. I'm sorry, I don't think my screen is showing. I'm sorry, let me just try this again. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. I apologize for that. Okay. The TMF should be updated and completed in a timely manner. So this is the EMA telling us that the TMF should be updated and completed in a timely manner, which means that if in your SOPs you don't have a, hopefully everyone can see this now. Just try this again. Okay. In your SOPs, if you do not have I apologize. This is, okay. If you do not have a time for which your documents should be filed in the TMF, you should, because the regulatory agencies are telling us that you need to have your documents filed in a timely manner. So I'm sorry, it just keeps going. I can't stop it. Okay, hopefully. Okay, it seems that you all can see my screen. So I'm just going to share from here because I can't control the presentation. Okay, so I apologize for the technical difficulties. It never seems to go right when I want it to. So the EMA has a draft guideline on the TMF, and it is in the process of being reviewed right now. It's in consultation period until mid-July. So we think that around the end of the year, hopefully around the end of the year, we will see the full final draft. And I'm sorry, Isaiah, can you just make sure that you can see my screen now? Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So how do you ensure that your TMF is complete and that you verify completeness? It's through an accurate and robust TMF QC. So in addition to the regulatory agencies telling us that we need to have a complete and accurate TMF, the industry is also telling us that we need an accurate and complete TMF. The TMF reference model group, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, I led a subgroup on quality last year, and we came up with recommendations for having a complete and accurate TMF. And a couple of things that came out of that, and you can see our recommendations there on the TMF reference model website. A few things that came out of those recommendations. So we said that in order to assess completeness, it's imperative to know what is expected to be in the TMF and when. So think about the milestones. Every single document that you collect within your TMF is associated with either a milestone or an event. Milestones are those things that occur regularly on a clinical trial, regardless of the phase or therapeutic area. So an example of a milestone is a first subject, first visit, first site initiated, final approved protocol. An example of an event is a PI change or a protocol amendment. So those are things that happen on a clinical trial that some type of document will be gathered, collected, created, etc., and then needs to be filed into the TMF. Completeness can be assessed against TMF specifications and also against a few things. Regulatory requirements, and we're going to talk about this in detail. Regulatory requirements, your company SOPs, and business processes. So these are things that your specific organization does, and this will help determine the number of iterations for a given artifact or document. So let's launch the first poll, and I'm able to do that, which is great. So the first poll is, do you currently have a TMF QC process in place? It's just a very simple yes or no question, and we'll give everyone a couple of seconds to answer this question. See, I see it moving, so I'll give everyone a couple seconds. Okay, I will close the poll now, and I will share the results. So it looks like most of you do have a TMF QC process in place, which is great. Then hopefully you'll be able to use some of these tips for today that we are sharing today. So the next poll is, I agree that TMF QC is important, but we struggle because, number one, actually there are a few options. So number one, it takes too much time. B, it takes too many resources. C, we do not have a process. D, we have a process, but we are not compliant. So I'll give everyone a couple of seconds to answer that question. Okay, and I will close the poll. I still see a couple people voting. Okay, I'll close the poll now, share the results. So 43% of you said that it takes too many resources. And I agree with you, and we are going to, I'm going to introduce probably a new concept to most of you today, and it's going to address that it takes too many resources issue. Coming in and second, we have a process, we are not compliant. And I think that that is something that we see at LMK very, very often, is that you have a process, but you can't comply with it because it may be because it takes too many resources, it takes too much time, or your process is so difficult to follow that you're not able to be compliant. That's usually what happens. And then 11%, you do not have a process. So hopefully you can take some of what you're learning today and develop a process. So thank you all for participating in the poll. So let's go to the slides, and let's get into why is TMF QC difficult. Well, few reasons. The first is defining expectations. So it's very difficult for a resource, people, group, etc., performing TMF QC to define what should be filed. How do I know how many versions of a data management plan should be present? How do I know how many versions of a 1572 should be present? It's very difficult to make that determination. The other reason is it's difficult to piece a study together. So we hear the analogy all the time that the TMF is a story of a clinical trial. Yes, that's true. It definitely is. And within that story, how many people have missing chapters or missing pages? I mean, it happens all the time. And it really goes back to what I was saying earlier about milestones and events. Having these documents come in that are expected, and then understanding the documents that should come in for unexpected things that happen. And then here's a new concept: centralized versus decentralized QC process. It's kind of an all or nothing approach. So centralized meaning you have a group of people who are performing the QC. They are not, typically they're not involved in the study. They're perhaps CTAs or CRAs that have some downtime, or perhaps even the records management group. They are performing the QC on the study. And it's difficult for them to determine the expectations of the study and to piece together a study that they didn't work on. And then we have the decentralized QC process. This is the concept of having the functional lines or the document owners performing their QC on their own documents. The difficulty with that is it's difficult to have the functional lines own their documents. It's usually, well, clinical operations is responsible for that. Clinical operations or equivalent is responsible for that. So it's true that about, depending on your organization and depending on the study, about 70 to 80% of the documents that are filed in the TMF are from clinical operations, but that still leaves 20 to 30% of the documents that come from other functions. So it's important to have those other functions involved in the QC process as well. So let's get into it. Let's talk about 10 ways that you can revamp your QC process. And for those of you that do not have a QC process in place, these are things that you can do to help develop a QC process. So step one is having a TMF QC plan. This QC plan is how to actually perform the review of TMF. And it should be system and file structure agnostic, which means that if you are like most organizations right now, you're operating in a model where you have files in multiple places. So for instance, you have files in your eTMF, and I'm saying that with air quotes, eTMF system. You have files in your paper system. You have files in both eTMF and paper. You may have multiple eTMF systems if you're going from one system to another. So this QC plan should really cover all of those mediums. The QC plan should also say who is responsible for performing QC. And it may be that you have different people who are responsible for different document types or artifacts, and that's okay, but that should be detailed in the QC plan. And then it should talk about the logistical controls of the QC. So for example, if there are 4 protocol amendments, and we know this because we have information from the CTMS, or we have logged all of the protocol amendments in a tracker, etc., then we should have the equivalent number of protocol approvals. And again, that example right there, that is very business process and business organization specific. Every organization may not have a protocol approval process. So it's very important to understand your own company SOPs. The QC plan will also state when to perform the QC. And we're going to talk about timing in a moment. And then what are the results and the corrective action going to be? And corrective action, I'm emphasizing this word, highlighting it. I have a flashlight on corrective action. We're going to talk about that in detail. It's so important to correct discrepancies. I just can't tell you enough about that. And then the TMF QC plan, it should be made available to all TMF stakeholders. And regardless if they are performing the QC or not, they may be involved in the corrective action portion, so they need to understand how the QC process works. Have proper training on the QC process. I mean, there's nothing worse than rolling out a process and then people aren't properly trained on it. The QC plan is definitely a living document. It's something that should be updated on an ongoing basis, use good version control, etc. But it's something that you should definitely update on an ongoing basis. I recommend having a sponsor version of a TMF QC plan and a CRO version of a QC plan. So think about, if you're a sponsor on the call, think about how are you going to oversee your CRO if they're responsible for the TMF portion. Or if you have delegated the TMF service to a company such as LMK, and we recommend this to our clients, how do you oversee LMK's portion or LMK's responsibility within the TMF? You have to demonstrate oversight. And having a TMF QC plan for a sponsor is very important. You can't just say, oh, my CRO is handling that. Because as a sponsor, and ICH GCP Release 2 is very explicit about this, the sponsor is responsible for the TMF. So it's very important that as a sponsor, you have controls and documentation in place, ensuring that you're overseeing what your CRO is doing. And then reference your established TMF SOP or SOPs if there are more than one, and processes. Make sure that you have some backup and information about why you're doing what you're doing, and why, if you have a protocol amendment, there should be the equal number of approvals. So have some documentation on that as well. Step 2 is tools. And as I mentioned with the process, it's fine and good to have a process, but you have to have the proper tools to document what you're doing. So have a TMF table of contents. And most people, when I say this, they say, oh, we're using the TMF reference model, which is great. It's perfect. Use the TMF reference model. It's such a great, it's more than a tool. I mean, it's such a great thing for us to have as an industry. I will say, though, you should not use the TMF reference model just straight off of the website. It's really important to map the TMF reference model to your own SOPs and to the way that you conduct clinical trials. If you don't, then you're going to end up in a situation where you have documents and you don't know where to file them because they don't match. So have a company-specific table of contents. And then from your company-specific table of contents, have a study-specific TMF table of contents. So maybe you're running a phase 1 study and you're not going to collect patient questionnaires. So that document type is not applicable to your study. So you want to have that information up front so that at the end of the study, you don't end up with empty file folders if you're using paper, or empty placeholders if you're using these fancy eTMF systems. You don't want to end up with that. You want to have a master table of contents for your TMF that is also a living document that's updated on an ongoing basis. So it tells you which documents you expect to file. A list of SOPs by study, that is also very important because that's going to help you when it comes to doing a true review, which we'll talk about, of your documents. How do I know which SOP was followed? Well, because I have a list of the SOPs that we use throughout the life of the study, with also start and stop dates. That's also very important. And then your study reference documents. So these are documents that are going to help you with making the determination of what's expected in terms of documents. So your protocols give a lot of information. Of course, it's not everything, but it's a lot of good information. And this helps the person performing TMF QC understand which documents should be filed. The list of countries, that's going to help with regulatory requirements, list of sites, etc. So all of that information, having that up front, that's going to help you with perform a successful TMF QC. When it comes to TMF specifications, understanding your organizational specific required documents, and again, I use the example of the protocol and the protocol approvals. Maybe you have a protocol approval for 7 different functions. Well, how will you know that if you don't have the TMF specifications and the business, understanding the business requirements up front? So that's very important. If you're using a clinical trial management system or equivalent, I know that for me personally, as a study, I managed studies for many years. We use CTMS systems, but before that, and I may be dating myself, but we used Excel trackers and we tracked everything on Excel. So if that is how you manage your study, there's nothing wrong with that. We've all done it. If you've been in the industry long enough, you have managed your study on an Excel tracker. Use that information to help you with the TMF QC process. Again, the protocol has a lot of good information. Again, not comprehensive. That's why you have to use your operational plans. For example, study monitoring plan. One question that we tend to get quite often is, how do I know how many monitoring visit reports should be filed? Well, Your study monitoring plan should give you an idea of how many visits should have occurred. And then once you have that information, then you have to also use the site visit log to determine how many times did the monitor actually go to the site. That's how many visit reports. And then if your SOPs require this, confirmation and follow-up letters should be filed within the TMF. And then you want to look at regulatory-driven documents. No two regulatory agencies are the same. They are different requirement. They all have different requirements. So it's very important to understand which documents you're going to expect and expect to see in the TMF based on the different countries around the world. And step 3, it's people. Having qualified people is going to make the difference with your QC. You really want to have experienced people that know clinical trials, preferably that know the study that's being QC'd. And if not, I mean, it happens where, going back to that centralized versus decentralized model, where you have a centralized model where all of the studies have to be QC'd by one group. And that's fine, but they should be really experienced people. And on top of their experience, have really good training in place to make sure that they know how to perform QC and that they're doing it in a consistent manner. So I kind of touched on the centralized versus decentralized model. I highly suggest everyone after this call determine what type of model you have within your organization, because this is really going to help drive compliance up when you understand this model. So in the centralized model, these people may or may not have been involved in the study. So they may require additional study-specific training. So one thing that I like to do personally when I'm QCing a study is I like to go back and look at the protocol training that the study team received at the beginning of the study. Maybe that was at the investigators meeting or the study team kickoff meeting, to understand more about the study, and that helps me understand what I should be looking for in terms of documentation. And then in the decentralized model, you have the document owners are responsible for performing their own QC. And I'll go into that in just a moment. So in these two different models, in the centralized model, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that these resources are properly trained. In the decentralized model, of course, they're all trained, they've worked on the study, etc., but you want to make sure that they are accountable for their QC and that there are some type of consequences for noncompliance, even if it's, putting their name on the board and keeping it up there and kind of escalating that for noncompliance. But you want to have a way to hold people accountable, because if you don't, then they'll never do it. There's no incentive for them to perform QC. No one likes to perform QC in the TMF. So you have to have a way to incentivize them and then also hold them accountable for the QC. The next step is timing. So timing is a really delicate situation because you want to have a schedule that is sustainable. You don't want to overburden people with performing TMF QC. So as I mentioned, no one likes to do it. No one likes to perform TMF QC. No one likes to go back and figure out, okay, how many protocols am I supposed to have? How many 1572s am I supposed to have? It's a difficult thing to do. So you want to make sure that you're setting people up for success and you have a schedule that everyone can follow. So in terms of document collection and filing, the QC intervals should be aligned with your company requirements and SOPs. So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar when I was having a little bit of technical difficulties, the regulatory agencies are really telling us that the TMF has to be contemporaneous with the clinical trial. So again, if you don't have a time in which your document should be filed in the TMF outlined clearly in your SOPs, that's something that you should really consider updating your SOPs to include. Otherwise, you'll have that graph that I showed earlier where all of the documents are filed at the end of the study. You want to look at document lifecycle. So different documents from different functional lines and team members come in at different times. I mean, you think about the statistician, for instance. A lot of their documents come in the beginning of the study and the end of the study. So you want to make sure that they have the proper training to perform TMF QC, but in that middle section when the study is ongoing and in maintenance, those statisticians may not have a lot of documents to look at. Then you want to look at study phase, because there's a huge impact on the document collection process and schedule. So phase 1 studies tend to be shorter and quicker versus the phase 3 studies that, especially the long-term studies that may go on for years. So you want to take that into consideration when you're coming up with a schedule as well for QC. So when we talk about timing, be consistent, otherwise you'll be out of compliance. And many of you, based on the poll question earlier, are not compliant with your process. And it could be because your schedule is not, it's not sustainable and it's difficult for people to follow. So follow the same schedule for all functional lines and study team members with no exceptions at all. So if you have that centralized model, make sure that that centralized group is following the same schedule for the study on an ongoing basis. If you have the decentralized model, make sure that those functional lines are reviewing their documents on an ongoing basis. Do not QC the same document twice. Make sure that when you have your process that it's set up in such a way that the documents will not be QC'd in a duplicative manner. Otherwise, it's going to cause frustration and people aren't going to do it. So make sure that your process is set up where documents are not QC'd twice. And perform remediation on discrepancies as soon as possible. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The next step is standardization. One thing that I have seen in my previous life, because I can't, well, it happens at LMK when we help our clients improve upon their TMF QC process. We see this a lot, especially in the centralized model. We see it some in the decentralized model, but especially in the centralized model, where the passing and the failing of documents is different. So you want to understand and make sure that your process clearly defines what constitutes a pass and what constitutes a fail. So this is just an example. You want to understand the type of documents that are collected and then subsequently reviewed, and then document the criteria for passing and failing a document so that everyone's on the same page, and determine if that document meets the appropriate criteria. So this is just an excerpt from our process at LMK of how we perform TMF QC. So the things that we look at is the document present, number one. Obviously, that's very important. Are all of the signatures present, if applicable? Are all of the fields complete, if applicable? The document date matches the established conventions. That's very important. Have a dating convention within your TMF guidelines, processes, SOPs, etc. And multiple versions of the document type are present. Did we have one monitoring plan, or was it updated on an ongoing basis? It's easy to figure out when you have 1, 4, and 5. Obviously, you're missing 2 and 3. It's more difficult when you have 1 through 5. You don't know if 6 and 7 are should be present, but that comes in with understanding the study and what happened on the study, etc. The next step is quality level. So my own personal quote is that there's no such thing as a perfect TMF, and I really believe that, but you have to understand what are you missing and what are you willing to accept. Consider the risks associated with missing documents, misfiled documents, or poor quality documents. ICH Release 2, GCP Release 2 talks a lot about risk and mitigating risk, and I think that that trickles down to the TMF as well. So when you have documents that are discrepant, you have to understand what is the risk of having those discrepant documents. Then you want to calculate the passes and fails and come up with a quality score for each of your studies. And this, it goes back to, what are you willing to accept for your studies? So this is an example of creating and calculating a quality, a TMF QC pass-fail for each and every study. So this is TMF Utopia, as I like to call it. So this is this is actually out of a database that we created for a client. And we're showing the current month, and then the previous month, and then the direction of change. So we're looking at the studies on an ongoing basis. Are they improving? Are they doing worse than the previous month or previous QC iteration, if it's quarterly, etc.? And how can we make changes? What do we need to do to improve upon that quality? The next step are understanding milestones and events. And I cannot stress this point enough. In my work with the Metrics Champion Consortium, the one thing that we're doing is really drilling down to each document on the TMF reference model, and if it's associated with a milestone or an event, and then within that, which milestone and event. So of course, milestones and event vary from organization to organization, and some companies have a very detailed list of their milestones, and some are a little bit more generic. It's difficult to keep up with a lot of different milestones, but each and every document filed is associated to either or a milestone or an event. So it's important to understand the documents that are expected or unexpected, because understanding this will help support the expected documents and what should be filed within the TMF. So a little bit more on milestones and events. And another, thing that I suggest everyone do after this call, if you can, is to take your TMF table of contents and assign each document to a milestone or an event, because this is really going to help with many different things. One, it's going to help with ensuring that the TMF is contemporaneous with the clinical trial. It's going to help the document owners. It's going to help the records management groups understand when documents should be filed in the TMF. And then on the back end, when it comes to performing TMF QC and making sure that the TMF is complete and accurate, it's going to help with understanding which documents should be filed. So if we look at the TMF at first subject, first visit, all the documents associated with first subject, first visit, and before should all be filed in the TMF. If we have an event, let's say we have a principal investigator change at a site, we know that all the documents associated with the PI change should be filed within that site. And then we should have some documentation, depending on your organization, perhaps at the study level, telling us that there was a PI change at a site. Step 8 is performing a true review of a TMF. And I personally, this is one of my pet peeves, is when I see a QC that looks like an actual TMF inventory. So it's not a true review of the TMF. So looking really at what's expected, and it's taking all of the things that I've mentioned before and a couple of things that I'll talk about in a moment, and really performing an in-depth QC of the documentation based on an understanding of the study. So again, all these things I talked about before, the study reference documents, the essential documents, the achieved study milestones, what has happened to date on that study. So if we look at that in a little bit more detail, I have an example here with subject questionnaires. And I think that subject questionnaires can be tricky, and it depends, again, on your filing structure. But we all know in clinical operations, clinical research, there's a difference between subject-directed questionnaires and then those from a rater. So, and the TMF reference model files those in two different places on purpose, as they should be, because they get analyzed differently. So I'm not going to get into all that. But when it comes to subject questionnaires, how do you know if a study had a subject questionnaire? Well, review the protocol. The protocol is going to tell us very clearly if there's a subject questionnaire. Okay, now that we've done that, we know that I expect to see a subject questionnaire. Let's take the Columbia Suicide Scale rating, for instance. We know that that CSSR is going to be filed in the TMF. we have to ensure that the appropriate number of iterations are filed for that document. And that's dependent on your organization. So you have kind of the organizational level, then you have the program level, maybe you have many different studies within one program, then you have the trial level or the study level, then the country, and then the site. So for subject questionnaires, if there are translations that are required, ensure that the translations are present. Those translations can be filed at the country or the site level depending on the study, but make sure that they're all present. And then you have to have approvals from the IRB for those subject questionnaires. So make sure that those are filed as well. And then you're going to perform QC for each document iteration. And what you're looking for is present, you're looking for the accurate location, the pages, etc. So that's how you really perform a true review of a document. Corrective action. My motto is, if you find it, you fix it. I mean, you do not want discrepancies in your TMF kind of lingering out there. The longer it's lingering, the harder it is to fix it. And you know, I said before, there's no such thing as a perfect TMF, but you really want to try to get to that if you can. So the way to correct discrepancies is to follow up with the responsible party to get that discrepancy corrected. And then you want to make sure you have a timeline for correcting the discrepancy. I like 2 weeks. I say, you know, don't let anything kind of go beyond 2 weeks. If it is, it's harder to correct. And then the method. What are you asking the responsible person for? Are you asking for a note to file, which don't? Oh my goodness, everyone's writing too many notes to file. That's for another day though. What are you asking them to do? Or does the document need to be refiled? Do you need a new iteration of the document? What exactly are you asking for? Once that has been corrected, you want to verify that the correction has been made and then close it out. You know, writing a note to file is not appropriate, and you're writing too many of them. And then you're signing them, which don't sign your notes to file. You're not doing yourself a favor. Review the discrepancy and determine the risk. If it's something that cannot be corrected, if you have a medical license that's missing from a sub-investigator who left the site and there's no way you're going to get it, what's the risk of that? Document your due diligence. This does not mean on a note to file. That could be in a monitoring visit report. We tried to obtain the medical license for Dr. Smith. He's no longer with the company. We tried to reach out to him on his personal email. We couldn't reach him. We went to the state website and it's not available, whatever the case may be. But document your due diligence. And then, of course, remediate as required and then close the issue. And again, it goes back to understanding your risk of which documents are discrepant. And then finally, be inspection ready. The TMF QC process and also the results of the TMF QC process can be one of the most important tools and processes in becoming inspection ready and really staying that way. I mean, you want to be in a constant state of inspection readiness. The TMF quality standards and metrics can help determine the health of your TMF. And then discrepancies can really identify potential exposure and possible findings. So you want to understand what those discrepancies are. Okay, time to launch a poll. Okay, how many of the 10 tips have you already implemented? 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, or all 10, or none? And none, perhaps, if you don't have the TMF QC process. Okay, and I'll give another couple of seconds to vote, and then I will close the poll. All right, I'll close the poll. And it looks like the majority of you have implemented between 5 and 7, which is great. Obviously, the more the better. It just helps with having a more robust TMF QC process. I'm surprised to see that 15% have implemented all 10. That's great. And sometimes you have all 10 and you have a robust process, but it's just difficult to carry it out. And then 3 to 5 and 1 to 3, those numbers, they don't surprise me. And then none, I think those are the folks that don't have a TMF QC process in place. So thank you very much for the poll. So here, I want to kind of go a little bit into inspection readiness. And I just want to say that ICH Release 2, I know that I've referenced it quite a bit today, but it's so important. And next week, the EMA is going to implement Release 2. So it's important to understand how Release 2 impacts your clinical trials and, of course, your TMF. And there is a constant theme in the addendum. It is to confirm that patients' rights and safety have been protected. So think about the documents that are collected in the TMF. You have IRB documents, you have informed consent, the informed consent templates, etc., and that your data is reliable. How can you ensure that your data is reliable? You're overseeing your vendors. You are performing quality checks of your data. You're going out to monitor, and those monitors are doing the verification of the source data. That's how you confirm that your data is reliable. Those two things translate into TMF documents. So it's really important to not underestimate the importance that the TMF plays in the overall clinical trial. Okay, one more poll. I'm sorry, we have 2 more polls. If a regulatory agency were to inspect your TMF today, would you have findings? Yes, no, or not sure. And I will give everyone a couple of seconds to vote here. Okay. And I'm going to close the poll. Okay. So the majority of you said yes, and that doesn't surprise me. And it's what we're seeing as a company, and it's what we're seeing as an industry. The MHRA, they're very vocal about the GCP inspection findings and the TMF findings. And if you look at the stats, they haven't posted the stats from 2016 yet. We're waiting with bated breath for them. I saw a preview of them, and they don't look good, honestly. And we're just seeing the numbers go up. We're just seeing more we're seeing more inspections. We're seeing more findings. And if you're on the phone and you're thinking, well, I don't run any of my studies in Europe, so it really doesn't matter kind of what the MHRA and EMA say. But just to let you know, the EMA and the FDA just completed a joint pilot of, I think, 11 studies for quality by design. And I think we're going to see more of this. We're going to see more joint inspections. Actually, I was involved in an inspection last year. The PMDA was the inspector. The FDA was there observing. So I think that we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more harmonization because of ICH Release 2 and the modernization of E8. So I don't know if everyone was aware that E8 is being updated as well, but that is going to cause more harmonization and actually another update to E6. E6 is going to have 4 addendums sometime next year. So it's really important to ensure that your processes are in place and that you're really complying with what the regulatory agencies are asking. Okay, so let's go to the next. Talk very quickly about frenemy of the state. I actually just wrote a blog about placeholders and how they're the mirage of the TMF. But basically, just to summarize, and I'm running low on time, but I just want everyone to know that technology is your frenemy, and a frenemy is a friend who's really an enemy. And maybe it's really you know, technology is really your friend, but you have to use it appropriately. And you can't just use it by itself when it comes to the TMF. So have proper processes and people in place to make sure that your technology is working for you, right? You don't want to work for the technology. I mean, you really want it to work for you and you want it to do what it's supposed to do. So have the proper processes and people in place to do that. All right, last poll question very quickly. I like to have interactive webinars. So if you have an eTMF system, do you use the completeness and QC functionality, or is the QC performed outside of the system? So in the system, outside of the system, both, or you're not sure. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds to answer this question. Okay, we have some good answers. All right, I'm going to close the poll, share the results. So most of you are doing it in both inside and outside the system. And that may, you know, be kind of difficult just from what I've seen. There are some really nice functionalities with some of the systems where you can flag pages that are discrepant, for instance, within the system. There's some new functionality where you can perform the entire QC in the system, and it's actually really nice. So I love technology. I love what's happening. I'm not an engineer, obviously, but I love what these very smart men and women are coming up with when it comes to the TMF. It's going to make our lives easier eventually. So because we're running a little bit short on time, we only have 2 minutes. I'm going to take a couple of questions. So, okay, there are a lot of questions in here that's saying that you can't see the slide. So I thank you all for, okay, so here. Okay, here's a good question. How should intentional blank artifacts be handled? So that's a really good question and something that we see a lot. So there are a couple of different ways to handle it. So some systems, if you have a eTMF system, you can assign a reason code for those placeholders that are blank. You know that they're going to be blank. There's no way that you're going to collect them. So that's one way to handle it within the system. The other way is to have a study level TMF table of contents. So that tells you I'm never going to collect this document. It's not, you know, for this particular study, and move on. You don't have to write a note to file. You know up front that it's not applicable, and you can just move on from that. So 2 ways to kind of handle it, either within the system or up front. My preference is up front. That way you don't have to kind of do anything within the system. Okay, and then so I will answer the rest of the questions. I have everyone's email address, and I can email you personally the questions. Here is our information, and Isaiah, I'll just close us out. Feel free to email us if you have any questions about TMF. We do offer complimentary consultations with our very highly skilled, trained TMF University resources. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. Follow us on social media. We have a lot of interesting blogs and tips that we kind of just throw out there. And we have a new feature on our website. It's called Claire, where people can just type in a question to Claire. It's actually very cool. Our Isaiah and his team came up with it, so thank you, Isaiah. And then if you will be at DIA in Chicago, we will be there. Booth 741. Some of our TMF experts will be on hand, and you can stop by the booth, talk to them about TMF QC, our LMK Complete service offering, our TMF University service offering, or just ask any questions that you may have. We're definitely here to help. And I want to thank you all so much again from on behalf of LMK. Thank you for joining us today. We definitely appreciate your time. And keep in touch with us if you have any questions or concerns about your TMF QC process. We're definitely here to help. And if you submitted a question on the question pane, I will answer those questions after the webinar. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.